I can still see her standing over me in that living room, hands on her hips like I was some disobedient child. Her face twisted with contempt as she screamed that I should be grateful they even let me stay under their roof. The roof I had signed for, the roof my credit made possible, and that I needed to pay more rent or pack my bags and find a nursing home willing to take an old bat like me. My son Daniel stood in the doorway during all of it, silent, staring at his phone screen like the weather report was more important than his mother being torn apart. I didn't cry right then. I just looked at her calmly and said one word. Okay. But inside, something broke that wouldn't ever heal the same way again. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone who's ever loved me calls me Maggie, and I'm 79 years old now. I've lived most of my life in a modest 3-bedroom house in suburban Ohio. The same house I'm sitting in right this very moment as I tell you this story. The house where I raised my Daniel after his daddy died in a car accident back in 1981 when my boy was only 9 years old. I can still remember how small Daniel looked at the funeral, how he held my hand so tight I thought my fingers might break, and how I promised him right there at the graveside that I would take care of us both no matter what it took. And I did take care of us. I worked as a school cafeteria manager for 38 years straight, standing on my feet 8 hours a day, serving hot meals to other people's children while saving every extra dollar I could squeeze out of my paycheck. I never remarried, never took a vacation I couldn't drive to, never bought anything I didn't absolutely need. Everything went into savings, into Daniel's future, into making sure he'd have opportunities his daddy never got to give him. When he went to college, I paid what the scholarships didn't cover. When he got his first job and needed a car, I helped with the down payment. When he met Claire 18 years ago and brought her home for Sunday dinner, I welcomed that girl like she was my own daughter, because I thought she'd be the family Daniel deserved. I should have seen the warning signs earlier than I did. Maybe I was just too hopeful, too grateful that my son had found someone who made him smile. Claire was pretty and polished, always dressed nice, always knew the right things to say to people who mattered. But there were little moments even back then. The way she'd glance at my worn furniture when she visited, the subtle wrinkling of her nose when I served pot roast instead of something fancier, the comments about how quaint my neighborhood was compared to where she grew up. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that every mother struggles with sharing her son, that I needed to give her time to warm up to me. When they got married, I gave them $5,000 as a wedding gift, money I'd been saving for a new roof I desperately needed. When they wanted to buy their first house a few years later, but their credit was shaky from Claire's student loans and some credit card debt, they asked if I would co-sign the mortgage. I remember Daniel sitting at this very kitchen table, looking nervous, explaining they'd found the perfect starter home, but the bank wanted a guarantor. He promised it was temporary, just until they built up their payment history. So I signed those papers because that's what mothers do. We help our children build their lives. 5 years after that, they came back with bigger dreams. They wanted to upgrade, they said, to a real home in a gated community, something with space for the grandkids, something that showed they'd made it. The price tag was $1.8 million, which made my hands shake when I saw it, but Daniel assured me it was a smart investment, that the neighborhood was appreciating fast, that they'd refinance within a year and take my name off the loan completely. Claire stood beside him, smiling, promising I'd always have a room there if I ever needed it, that we'd be one big happy family. I wanted to believe them so badly that I ignored the small voice in my head asking why they needed such an expensive house when they had 2 incomes and only 2 children. So I signed again. I put my name on a mortgage for $1.2 million, making myself liable for a debt I could never pay off in 3 lifetimes. They moved into that mansion with its soaring ceilings and chandelier in the entryway and pool in the backyard. And for a while they seemed happy. They had parties where Claire's friends admired everything, where Daniel grilled expensive steaks, where the girls ran around in their designer clothes. They never refinanced. Every time I asked about it, Daniel said the rates weren't quite right yet, or they were waiting for Claire's bonus, or it would happen next quarter. After a while, I stopped asking because I could see it made him uncomfortable. Then my knees started giving out on me. Arthritis settled into the joints like rust on old hinges, and the stairs in my little house became a mountain I couldn't climb twice a day. Getting up from chairs hurt. Walking to the mailbox hurt. Some mornings I'd wake up and need 20 minutes just to straighten my legs enough to stand. I was 76 by then, living alone, and one evening Daniel called and suggested, gently, like it was his own idea, that maybe I should come stay with them for a while, just until I felt stronger. Claire got on the phone and agreed, saying they had plenty of space, that I shouldn't be alone struggling like that. I moved in thinking it would be temporary. I packed 2 suitcases and my file folder of important papers, left most of my furniture behind, and drove over to their gated community, where I had to stop at the guardhouse and explain I was family before they'd let me through. They gave me a room on the first floor, a guest room that Claire had decorated in whites and grays, everything pristine and cold. I tried to make it feel like home with a few photographs and my favorite quilt, but it never quite did. From the start, I paid rent, $800 a month, pulled from my Social Security check, and the small pension I got from the school district. I insisted on it because I didn't want to be a burden, didn't want Claire to have any reason to resent me being there. I cooked dinners most nights, cleaned up after myself, babysat my great-grandchildren when Daniel and Claire wanted date nights or weekend trips. I kept my belongings neat, stayed in my room when they had company, tried to be invisible and helpful at the same time. But Claire started making comments. Little ones at first, asking if I really needed to keep my old sewing basket in the living room closet, wondering aloud if old people just accumulated clutter naturally, sighing when she had to move my reading glasses off the kitchen counter. Then bigger ones, suggesting I might be more comfortable in a senior living community where I'd have people my own age, asking Daniel in front of me if we'd looked into what my long-term care plan was going to be. I pretended not to hear most of it, told myself she was just stressed with work and the kids, that I shouldn't take it personally. The truth I didn't want to face was that I'd become an inconvenience in a house I'd made possible. They threw parties in rooms I'd co-signed for, complained about property taxes on land my credit had secured, lived a lifestyle they couldn't truly afford while I shuffled quietly through their marble hallways trying not to be noticed. I watched my son become someone I didn't quite recognize anymore, someone who looked at his phone instead of his mother, who nodded along when his wife made cruel jokes, who seemed embarrassed when his country club friends asked who the old lady in the corner was. Then came that Tuesday evening. It had been raining all day, one of those cold November rains that seeps into your bones and makes everything ache worse. I was watching my television shows in the living room, one of the only things I still did just for myself, when Claire came storming in from the hallway. She'd just opened the property tax bill, and apparently it had gone up again, something about a special assessment for the gated community's new fountain and landscaping. Her face was flushed red, and I knew before she opened her mouth that I was about to become the target of whatever anger she was carrying. She stood over my chair, towering above me with her hands on her hips, and the words that came out of her mouth felt like acid burning through everything I'd ever believed about family and love and sacrifice. She told me I should be grateful they let me live there, called me an old bat, said they were the ones carrying me like I was dead weight, demanded I pay more rent or leave and find a nursing home that would take me. Every word was a slap. Every syllable confirmed what I'd been afraid of for months, that I wasn't family to her. I was a burden, an obligation, something to be tolerated until I could be disposed of. And my son, my Daniel, the boy I'd raised alone, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, he just stood there in the doorway looking at his phone. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't even look up. Upstairs I could hear my granddaughters giggling about something, completely oblivious to the fact that their grandmother's heart was being shredded in the room below them. I didn't cry, though I wanted to. I didn't yell back, though part of me wanted to scream until my voice gave out. Instead, I looked at Claire with a calmness that surprised even me and said just one word. Okay. Then I stood up slowly, my knees protesting every inch, and walked to my room and closed the door. That night, after the house went quiet and I could hear them sleeping in their master suite down the hall, I pulled out the old accordion file folder I'd kept under my bed. Inside were all the documents from both mortgages, the original starter home papers, and the massive loan for this mansion. I spread them out on my bed under the lamp and read through every page like I was seeing them for the first time. The terms were clear. As cosigner, I wasn't just a formality, I was a full guarantor, meaning if they defaulted, the bank could come after everything I owned, but also meaning I had legal standing to protect that collateral if I believed they were acting in bad faith. And there was something else I'd almost forgotten about. Something I'd been doing quietly for years without really thinking about why. I'd been making small extra principal payments on that mortgage from my savings account. Sometimes $50, sometimes $100, just little amounts I could spare to chip away at the balance and reduce my own exposure. I'd kept records of every payment in a little notebook, and as I sat there that night looking at the numbers, I realized I'd paid down nearly $40,000 over the years, money that came from my Social Security, my pension, my careful scrimping, while they bought luxury vacations and posted photos online about their blessed life. The loan agreement had a clause I'd barely noticed when I signed. As cosigner, I could demand full repayment if I believed the borrowers were endangering the collateral through financial irresponsibility, or if continuing the arrangement would cause me undue hardship. I read that clause 3 times in the dim light of my bedside lamp, and something shifted inside my chest. Not anger exactly, but a cold, clear certainty that I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for people who saw me as disposable. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in that guest room bed listening to the rain against the windows, thinking about all the years I'd worked and saved and given, thinking about my husband's grave and the promises I'd made, thinking about the little boy who used to hold my hand, and the man who now couldn't be bothered to look up from his phone while his wife destroyed me. And somewhere in those dark hours, I made a decision that would change everything. I woke up that Wednesday morning before dawn, like I'd done almost every day of my adult life, but this time felt different. My body ached from not sleeping, my eyes were dry and scratchy, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months, maybe years. I lay there in the gray light seeping through the curtains of that cold guest room, listening to the house settle around me, and I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't stay another day in a place where I was treated like garbage someone forgot to take out. I got dressed slowly, my fingers fumbling with buttons that suddenly seemed too small, and I packed my 2 suitcases with the same careful precision I'd used when I moved in. Every photograph went back into its frame protector, every piece of clothing folded just so, my medications sorted into their weekly container. I moved quietly because I didn't want to wake anyone, didn't want to have a conversation or hear excuses or see Daniel's face trying to smooth things over like he always did when Claire went too far. I just wanted to leave with whatever dignity I had left. But before I walked out that door, I had one phone call to make. I sat on the edge of that perfectly made guest bed, the one I'd been sleeping in for 3 years while paying rent to live in a house my signature had bought, and I pulled out the business card I'd found in my file folder the night before. It was from the Private Client Services Department at the bank, the special line they give to cosigners with significant exposure on large loans. I'd gotten it years ago when I first signed the mansion mortgage, tucked it away thinking I'd never need it, but I kept it just the same because that's what careful people do. My hands shook as I dialed the number. It was barely 7 in the morning, but the card said 24-hour service, and sure enough, a polite young woman answered on the 3rd ring. I told her my name, gave her the loan number I'd memorized from staring at those documents all night, and explained as calmly as I could that I was the cosigner on a $1.8 million mortgage, and I needed to discuss my options regarding potential default and borrower bad faith. She transferred me to a loan officer named Mr. Peters, and his voice was kind but professional when he came on the line. I told him everything, not with tears or drama, but with the plain facts laid out like items on a grocery list. I explained that I'd been verbally abused by the primary borrowers, threatened with eviction from a home I was paying rent to live in, that I had evidence of financial irresponsibility including screenshots I'd saved of Claire's social media posts bragging about luxury vacations to Hawaii and Europe, while she claimed they were struggling with bills. I told him I'd been making extra principal payments for years that they didn't even know about, that I was 79 years old and frightened for my financial security, and that I wanted to exercise whatever rights I had under the cosigner agreement to protect myself. Mr. Peters was quiet for a moment after I finished, and I could hear him typing on his keyboard. Then he asked me to hold while he pulled up the full account history. Those minutes felt like hours, sitting there in that guest room with my packed suitcases by the door, waiting to find out if I had any power at all, or if I was just a foolish old woman who'd signed her life away. When he came back on the line, his tone had changed, more serious, more focused. He told me that yes, as cosigner I did have certain rights, especially given the pattern he was seeing in the account records. Apparently, Claire and Daniel had been making only minimum payments for the past 8 months, sometimes paying late, sometimes skipping the extra amounts they'd originally committed to. The account was current enough not to trigger automatic default proceedings, but it showed financial stress that, combined with my testimony about their spending habits and the verbal abuse, gave grounds for the bank to invoke the acceleration clause if I formally requested it. The acceleration clause. He explained it to me in simple terms. If the bank determined that the borrowers were acting in bad faith or that my position as cosigner was being exploited, they could demand immediate payment of the full remaining balance, all $1.2 million of it, within 30 days. If Daniel and Claire couldn't pay, the property would go into foreclosure. It was a nuclear option, Mr. Peters said gently, and I should think very carefully before requesting it because there would be no going back once the process started. I didn't hesitate. I told him to do it. I told him to send the formal notice immediately, and I gave him my old address, the house I still owned, the house I'd never sold because something in my gut had told me to keep it, as my contact information going forward. He said the letter would go out by certified mail that day, that Daniel and Claire would have it within 48 hours, and that I should prepare myself for their response because it would likely be intense. After I hung up, I sat there for a long moment just breathing. Then I picked up my suitcases, walked out of that guest room without looking back, and let myself out the front door of that mansion while everyone was still asleep. I drove through the empty streets as the sun was just starting to come up, and with every mile between me and that gated community, I felt something loosening in my chest, something that had been wound tight for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe all the way down. My little house was exactly as I'd left it. A bit dusty, a bit cold from being mostly empty for 3 years, but mine. I walked through the rooms touching the walls like I was greeting old friends, and I started crying then, not sad tears exactly, but something deeper and more complicated. Relief maybe, mixed with grief for everything I'd lost, and everything I'd been willing to give up just to feel needed by my own child. I spent that first day back home cleaning and settling in, making the bed with my old familiar sheets, hanging my clothes back in my own closet, putting my photographs on my own shelves where they belonged. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't send a text. I just moved through my house doing normal things while waiting for the bomb I'd set to go off in their perfect lives. The certified letter arrived at their mansion on Friday morning. I know because that's when my phone started ringing. Daniel called first, around 10 o'clock, and I let it go to voicemail. His message was confused, almost panicked. Mom, we got this crazy letter from the bank saying they're demanding full payment on the house in 30 days. There must be some mistake. Can you call me back? We need to figure this out. 20 minutes later, Claire called. Her voicemail was different, angry, accusing. Margaret, what did you do? Did you call the bank and say something? This is insane. You're going to ruin us. Call me back right now. Then both of them together on speakerphone. Their voices talking over each other in a message so frantic I could barely understand it. Mom, please, we don't understand what's happening. The bank says you requested this. They're going to take our house. The girls will have to change schools. Everything we've worked for will be gone. You have to fix this. Call them back. Tell them it was a mistake. I listened to every message, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I didn't call back. Not that day, not that night. Not when the messages turned from confused to furious to sobbing. I just let the phone ring and ring while I watered the plants I'd left behind, while I made myself dinner in my own kitchen, while I watched the sunset from my own living room window. By Saturday, the messages were coming every hour. Daniel left one where he was clearly crying, his voice breaking as he begged me to explain what was happening, saying he was sorry if they'd done something wrong, asking me to please just talk to them. Claire left one that was pure rage, screaming that I was a vindictive old woman who'd never appreciated anything they'd done for me, that I was destroying their children's lives out of spite, that she'd always known I was jealous of their success. Sunday morning, they showed up at my door. I watched them pull up from my living room window, Daniel's expensive car looking out of place on my modest street, and I took my time answering when they knocked. When I finally opened the door, they both looked terrible. Claire's makeup was smeared, her hair uncombed. Daniel had circles under his eyes so dark they looked like bruises. They tried to push inside, But I stood in the doorway and didn't move. Daniel started talking fast, saying there'd been a misunderstanding, that they never meant to make me feel unwelcome, that of course I was family and they loved me. Claire stood behind him nodding, her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, and I could see her hands shaking. I told them we could talk, but not inside my house. I told them to wait while I got my jacket, and then I walked them down to the little park at the end of my street, the same park where I used to push Daniel on the swings when he was small. We sat at a picnic table under the bare November trees, and I let them talk themselves out. All the excuses, all the promises, all the desperate bargaining. When they finally ran out of words, I pulled out the copies of the mortgage documents I'd brought with me. I spread them on that picnic table and showed them what I'd highlighted. The cosigner clause, the acceleration provision, the record of my extra payments they'd never even known about. I showed them Claire's social media posts I'd printed out. The photos of their Hawaiian vacation from August, the pictures of their new boat from September, the posts about shopping trips and spa days and expensive dinners out. I told them the truth in the same quiet voice I'd used to read bedtime stories to Daniel when he was young. I told them that when Claire had screamed at me to be grateful or get out, something inside me had finally broken. I told them I was done being treated like a burden in a home I'd made possible, done pretending their cruelty was normal, done sacrificing myself for people who couldn't even bother to defend me when it mattered most. Daniel's face went completely white as he stared at those documents spread across the picnic table. I watched him pick up the paper showing my extra payments, $40,000 over 6 years, and his hands started trembling so badly the paper rattled in the cold November wind. He looked at me like he'd never seen me before, like I was a stranger who'd somehow replaced his mother overnight, and maybe in a way I was. The woman who would have swallowed that abuse and kept quiet had died on that Tuesday evening when he'd stood silent in the doorway. Claire made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and she grabbed Daniel's arm with both hands like she was drowning. And he was the only thing keeping her afloat. But we didn't know, she kept saying over and over. We didn't know you were making extra payments. We didn't know you felt that way. You never said anything. You never told us we were hurting you. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and I felt something close to pity mixed with disgust. She was right in a way. I hadn't told them, hadn't complained, hadn't drawn clear lines in the sand. I'd done what so many women of my generation were taught to do. I'd made myself small and quiet and grateful for whatever crumbs of affection came my way. But she was also so very wrong, because you shouldn't need to be told that screaming at an elderly woman to get out or pay up is cruel. You shouldn't need a manual to understand that treating someone's sacrifice like an entitlement is wrong. You called me an old bat, I said quietly, my breath making small clouds in the cold air. You told me to find a nursing home. You said those things in front of my son, your husband, and he didn't say a word. Not one word in my defense. I turned to Daniel then, and I saw shame flood his face, saw him look away from me like a child caught stealing. I raised you better than that, Daniel. I know I did. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Mom, I was just trying to keep the peace. Claire was stressed about money, and I thought if I stayed out of it, things would blow over. I didn't think. You didn't think I mattered enough to defend. I finished for him, and the words hung in the air between us heavy as stones. You didn't think your mother's dignity was worth a moment of discomfort with your wife. That's what you're telling me. We sat there in that park for another hour while they cycled through every stage of grief and desperation. Denial came first. Surely the bank would work with them. Surely there was some way to refinance quickly. Surely I could just call and explain it was all a misunderstanding. Then anger. How could I do this to my own son, to my grandchildren? Didn't I care about family at all? Wasn't I being just as cruel as I accused them of being? Then bargaining. What if they apologized publicly? What if they paid me back for every extra payment? What if Claire moved out and it was just Daniel and the girls? What if they made me part owner of the house officially? I listened to all of it without speaking, and when they finally wound down into exhausted silence, I told them the truth that I'd been turning over in my mind for days. Even if I wanted to call the bank back, I said slowly, which I don't, they wouldn't stop this process now. Once you invoke an acceleration clause based on borrower bad faith, they take it seriously. They've reviewed your payment history, seen the late payments, seen the pattern. They've made their decision. Claire started crying then. Real tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking. We'll lose everything, she whispered. The house, our standing in the community, the girls' school, everything we've built. How can you watch your own family lose everything and not care? That word, family, hit me like a slap, and I felt anger rise up in my throat hot and bitter. You want to talk about family? My voice came out harder than I'd intended, and both of them flinched. Family is what I gave you when I co-signed that first mortgage and didn't ask for anything in return. Family is what I gave you when I signed for this mansion and trusted you to refinance. Family is what I gave you when I paid rent to live in a house I was legally responsible for. When I cooked your meals and watched your children, and made myself invisible, so you could pretend to your friends that you'd achieved all this on your own. Don't you dare talk to me about family when you threw that word away the moment it became inconvenient. We left the park with nothing resolved. They drove away in their expensive car, and I walked back to my little house alone. And I felt hollowed out and exhausted but also strangely free. That night I slept better than I had in years, and when I woke up Monday morning, I didn't check my phone for messages. I just made myself breakfast and sat in my sunny kitchen reading the newspaper, doing the crossword puzzle with my morning coffee, living like a person instead of a ghost. The calls and messages continued for days. Daniel's got more desperate, more broken. He left long rambling voicemails about memories from his childhood, about how much he loved me, about how sorry he was that he'd let me down. He talked about the time I'd sat up with him all night when he had pneumonia at age 12, about how I'd worked double shifts to pay for his college textbooks, about how he'd always known I sacrificed everything for him, and he'd taken it for granted. Each message was like a knife twisting in my heart, but I didn't call back because I knew what would happen. I'd hear his pain and I'd fold. I'd make it all better like I always had, and nothing would actually change. Claire's messages were different. They started angry, then turned manipulative, then finally settled into a kind of cold practicality. She left one message where she laid out their financial situation in brutal detail. They had maybe $60,000 in savings, nowhere near enough for the balloon payment. Their income was high but mostly went to maintaining their lifestyle. They couldn't possibly get a traditional loan approved in time. She said they'd talked to lawyers who told them that yes, as cosigner I had every right to do what I'd done, that there was no legal recourse for them, that they were completely trapped. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. The girls ask about you every day. They don't understand why Grandma left without saying goodbye. They think they did something wrong. I hope you can live with that. I sat there holding the phone after that message ended, feeling sick. My great-granddaughters. Emily, who was 9, and Sarah, who was 7. I hadn't even thought about how this would affect them. I'd been so focused on Claire and Daniel, on my own hurt and anger, that I'd forgotten about 2 little girls who loved their grandma, and didn't understand why the grown-ups in their lives were suddenly acting so strange. But then I thought about what kind of lesson I'd be teaching them if I backed down now. What would I be telling Emily and Sarah about how women should let themselves be treated? About what family really means? About standing up for yourself even when it's hard? Would I be helping them by showing them that love means accepting abuse? That you should sacrifice yourself endlessly for people who don't value you? That your own dignity doesn't matter as long as you keep the peace? No. I'd lived that lesson my whole life, and I wouldn't pass it on to another generation of girls who deserved better. The 30-day deadline approached like a storm on the horizon. I heard through a neighbor who knew someone in their neighborhood that Daniel and Claire were frantically trying to secure emergency financing, that they'd approached Claire's parents for a loan and been turned down, that they'd even tried to get a second mortgage on the property, but no bank would touch it with the acceleration clause hanging over them. I heard they'd put the mansion on the market trying to sell it quickly, but real estate transactions don't happen overnight, and even if they found a buyer tomorrow, closing would take longer than they had. I didn't feel triumphant hearing these things. I just felt tired and sad and old. Some nights I lay in my bed, my own bed in my own house, and wondered if I'd made the right choice. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, how he'd crawl into bed with me after his daddy died and cry himself to sleep while I stroked his hair. I thought about all the birthday parties I'd thrown for him, all the school plays I'd attended, all the scraped knees I'd bandaged and bad dreams I'd chased away. Had that little boy really grown into a man who'd stand silent while someone destroyed his mother? Yes, he had. And I had to accept that truth even though it broke my heart into pieces. On day 28, my doorbell rang at 8 in the morning. I looked through the window and saw Daniel standing there alone, his shoulders hunched against the cold, looking smaller somehow than I remembered. I almost didn't answer, but something in his posture, the way he looked so lost and defeated, made me open the door. He didn't try to come inside. He just stood there on my porch with his hands in his pockets and said, "Mom, can I talk to you? Just me. Claire doesn't know I'm here." I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and nodded. And we sat on my porch steps side by side like we used to do when he was young and had problems he needed to work through. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, "We're going to lose the house. You know that, right? It's really going to happen. We've tried everything." "I know," I said. "The girls are devastated. We had to tell them we're moving, that they'll be changing schools mid-year." Sarah cried for 2 hours. I felt those words about Sarah crying hit me right in the center of my chest, but I didn't let myself crumble the way I might have even a month before. I looked at my son sitting beside me on the porch steps, this man who'd once been my whole world, and I said what needed to be said. "Those girls are crying because of choices you and Claire made, Daniel. Not because of me." He flinched like I'd struck him, and his voice came out raw and broken. "How can you say that? You're the one who called the bank. You're the one who made this happen. We would have been fine if you'd just..." "If I'd just what?" I interrupted. And my voice was sharper than I intended. "If I'd just kept quiet while your wife screamed at me? If I'd just accepted being treated like garbage in a home my credit bought? If I'd just continued making myself smaller and smaller until I disappeared completely?" I turned to look at him directly, and I saw tears running down his face. "Tell me, Daniel. What exactly should I have done differently?" He couldn't answer. He just sat there crying silently, his shoulders shaking, and I felt my own eyes burning, but I blinked the tears back. I'd cried enough over this situation already, shed enough tears in the dark of night when nobody could see. Right now I needed to stay strong, needed to make him understand what he still seemed unable to grasp. "You stood in that doorway," I said quietly, "and you watched your wife call your mother an old bat. You watched her tell me to get out or pay up. You watched her threaten to dump me in a nursing home like I was trash you needed to dispose of. And you said nothing. You didn't defend me. You didn't ask her to stop. You just stood there looking at your phone like the weather report was more important than your mother's heart being torn apart." "I was trying to keep the peace," he whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to him, I could tell. "There's no peace in watching someone you love be destroyed, son. There's just cowardice." The word hung in the air between us, harsh and true. I didn't raise you to be a coward. I raised you to be a man who stood up for what was right, who protected people who couldn't protect themselves, who valued loyalty and kindness over comfort and convenience. Somewhere along the way, you forgot those lessons. We sat in silence for a long while after that. A car drove by, and I watched it pass, thinking about all the ordinary moments that make up a life, all the small choices that accumulate into the person you become. Daniel wiped his face with his sleeve like he used to do as a boy, and when he spoke again, his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear him. I knew it was wrong. Even while it was happening, I knew. But Claire gets so angry when I contradict her in front of other people, and it's easier to just let her have her way. It's been like that for years, Mom. I take the path of least resistance, and I tell myself I'm being mature, being a good husband, choosing my battles. But really I'm just weak. He looked at me then with eyes full of shame, and something that might have been the beginning of real understanding. "I failed you. I know I did. And I don't know how to fix it." Part of me wanted to comfort him right then, to put my arm around his shoulders and tell him it would all be okay like I'd done 1,000 times before. But that would be a lie, and we were past the point where lies helped anyone. You can't fix it, Daniel. That's what you need to understand. Some things, once they're broken, don't go back together the same way. You can apologize, you can mean it with your whole heart, but you can't undo what happened in that living room. You can't undo 3 years of watching me make myself smaller, while Claire made me feel worthless. And you can't undo the fact that when it really mattered, You chose her cruelty over my dignity." He made a sound like something dying in his throat, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "So that's it. You're just done with me? I'm your son, Mom. Doesn't that count for anything? You being my son is exactly why this hurts so much," I told him, and now my own voice was shaking. "You think this is easy for me? You think I wanted any of this? I would have given anything, everything, for you to just stand up and tell Claire to stop. That's all it would have taken. One moment of courage, one moment of choosing me, and none of this would be happening. But you didn't do that. And now we both have to live with the consequences." The bank's deadline arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, exactly 30 days after they'd sent the acceleration notice. I knew because Mr. Peters called me at 9 o'clock to inform me that Daniel and Claire had been unable to meet the payment requirement, and the property was now officially in foreclosure proceedings. He explained the timeline. They had 90 days to vacate, the house would be sold at auction, and depending on how much it sold for, there might or might not be equity left over for them after the bank recouped their losses. I thanked him for keeping me informed and hung up the phone. And then I just sat there in my kitchen staring at my hands. It was done. Really truly done. There was no going back now, no last-minute miracle, no way to pretend this wasn't happening. My son and his family were going to lose their home, and I was the one who'd made it happen. I waited for guilt to crush me, for regret to make me pick up the phone and beg Mr. Peters to stop the process, but those feelings never came. Instead, I felt a strange kind of peace settling over me like a warm blanket. I'd drawn a line in the sand. I'd said enough is enough. I'd chosen my own worth over being endlessly available for people who didn't value me. And yes, it hurt. God, it hurt so much. But it was a clean hurt, not the festering wound of ongoing mistreatment. Over the next weeks, I watched from a distance as their world unraveled. I didn't go looking for information, but my neighborhood has eyes and ears and word travels. I heard they'd found a townhouse to rent on the other side of the city. Nothing fancy but respectable enough. I heard Claire had to take the girls out of their private school and enroll them in public school instead. I heard she'd deleted all her social media accounts after someone commented on one of her old vacation photos asking how she could afford Hawaii if she couldn't afford her mortgage. I heard Daniel had started seeing a therapist, and that surprised me more than anything else. My son had always been the type to push emotions down and pretend everything was fine, so the fact that he was actively seeking help meant something had shifted inside him. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I just filed it away with all the other complicated feelings I was trying to process. The hardest part was the girls. Emily and Sarah sent me a letter, an actual handwritten letter that arrived in my mailbox addressed in Emily's careful 9-year-old cursive. Inside, they'd both written notes telling me they missed me, asking why I didn't visit anymore, wondering if they'd done something wrong. Sarah had drawn a picture of our family. Her, Emily, Daniel, Claire, and me, all holding hands in front of their big house with a rainbow overhead. At the bottom she'd written, "I love you, Grandma," with a heart dotting the I. I cried over that letter. I cried like I hadn't let myself cry through this whole nightmare. Sitting at my kitchen table with tears dripping onto those precious pages, my heart breaking for two innocent children, who didn't understand why the adults in their lives couldn't just fix things and make everything okay again. They didn't know about the cruelty or the silence or the years of quiet diminishment. They just knew their grandma had left and their whole world was changing and nobody would explain why. I wanted so badly to write back, to tell them it wasn't their fault, that I loved them more than words could say, that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt everyone including the people they love most. But I knew if I opened that door even a crack, Claire would use it. She'd push those girls forward as shields, would weaponize their innocence and my love for them to try to manipulate me into backing down. So instead, I put their letter in a special box in my closet and told myself that someday, when they were older, I'd be able to explain everything in a way they could understand. The auction happened on a cold day in February. I didn't attend, but Mr. Peters called to tell me the house had sold for $1.6 million. Less than they'd paid for it, but enough to cover the outstanding mortgage balance and some of the fees. There would be no equity for Daniel and Claire to reclaim. Everything they'd invested in that house, down payment, improvements, years of mortgage payments, was simply gone. They'd walk away with nothing except whatever belongings they could fit in their new, smaller life. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt like justice had been served. Instead, I just felt empty and sad, like I'd won a battle but lost something I could never get back. The house felt different after the auction finalized. Not the mansion. I'd never think of that place as anything but a cold monument to other people's ambitions. But my own little house, the one I'd lived in since 1972, it felt lighter somehow, like a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying had finally lifted from the walls and floors and ceilings. I walked through the rooms in those early March days, touching furniture I'd owned for decades, looking at photographs of a life I'd built with my own two hands, and I started to remember who I'd been before I became someone's burden. I'd been Maggie Thompson, cafeteria manager, who made the best macaroni and cheese in 3 counties. I'd been Maggie Thompson, widow, who'd raised a son alone and done it with grace and determination. I'd been Maggie Thompson, neighbor, who brought casseroles when people were sick and watched children when parents needed help and kept her lawn neat and her porch swept. Somewhere in the years of trying to be useful to Daniel and Claire, I'd forgotten that I was a whole person with value that had nothing to do with what I could give them. So I started doing things just for myself. Small things at first, because I'd been trained for so long to consider everyone else before my own wants. I bought myself new curtains for the living room, bright yellow ones with white flowers that Claire would have called tacky, but that made me smile every time I looked at them. I planted bulbs in my front garden, even though my knees protested every moment I spent kneeling in the dirt, because I wanted to see tulips and daffodils come spring. I started going to the senior center on Wednesday afternoons for their quilting circle, something I'd stopped doing when I moved in with Daniel because Claire said it seemed old-fashioned. The women at the quilting circle welcomed me back like I'd never left. Martha, who was 83 and sharp as a tack, took one look at my face the first day I returned and said, "You look lighter, Maggie. Like you set down something heavy." I almost cried right there over my fabric squares, and I found myself telling them everything. Not the details that would violate Daniel's privacy, but the broad strokes of what had happened, how I'd finally stood up for myself and lost my son in the process. They didn't judge me. They didn't tell me I should forgive and forget, or that family was everything, or that I'd regret my choice someday. Instead, Martha squeezed my hand and said, "Good for you. Nobody should treat their mother like that and expect her to just take it." And Rosa, who was 71 and had her own complicated family stories, nodded and said, "Sometimes loving yourself means disappointing people who took you for granted. That's not cruelty, that's survival." I cried a little then, letting the tears fall while these women I barely knew sat with me in my pain, and something inside my chest unclenched. I'd been so alone for so long, trying to be everything to Daniel and Claire while making myself nothing, that I'd forgotten what community felt like. I'd forgotten that there were people in the world who might actually care about Maggie Thompson the person, not just Maggie Thompson the mother or the cosigner, or the convenient babysitter. As the weeks passed, I found myself building a life I actually wanted to live. I started going to the library every Tuesday morning, picking out mystery novels that I'd read in my sunny armchair with a cup of tea. I joined a walking group for seniors that met at the park 3 times a week, moving slowly with my aching knees but moving nonetheless, breathing fresh air, and listening to birds and talking with people who didn't want anything from me except my company. I even started taking a watercolor painting class at the community college, something I'd always wanted to try, but never had time for when I was working and raising Daniel, and trying to keep everyone happy. My instructor was a young woman named Amy, probably in her 30s, who had infinite patience with us older students and our shaking hands and failing eyesight. She'd put on soft music and set out paints and paper, and she'd walk us through simple exercises. Painting a sunset, painting flowers, painting whatever we saw in our minds. I was terrible at it, my trees looking more like green blobs than anything recognizable, but it didn't matter. For 2 hours every Thursday evening, I sat in that bright classroom and made messes with watercolors, and I felt more alive than I had in years. The money I'd been spending on rent to live in Daniel's house started accumulating in my savings account. $800 a month doesn't sound like much to people who live in mansions, but to me it was significant. I used some of it to fix the things in my house that had been falling apart while I was gone, got the leaky faucet in the bathroom repaired, replaced the worn carpet in my bedroom, had someone come fix the crack in my driveway. I used some of it to treat myself to small luxuries I denied myself for years. Good coffee instead of the cheap stuff, fresh flowers from the farmer's market, a new comfortable robe that made me feel cozy on cold mornings. And I started saving for something I'd dreamed about since I was young, but never thought I'd actually do. A trip. Not anything extravagant, just a week-long bus tour through New England to see the fall leaves. I'd always wanted to see Vermont in October, wanted to stay in little bed and breakfasts and eat maple syrup, and take photographs of covered bridges. It seemed silly at my age, with my bad knees and my fixed income, but every time I added another $100 to my travel fund, I felt a thrill of excitement that reminded me I was still capable of wanting things just for the joy of them. My phone still rang sometimes. Daniel called every couple of weeks, leaving short messages that were heavy with things unsaid. He'd tell me about his therapy sessions sometimes, about what he was learning about himself, about boundaries and codependency and learned helplessness. He never asked me to forgive him or to fix what had broken. He just talked, like he was trying to rebuild some kind of connection without expecting anything in return. I listened to the messages, but I still didn't call back. I wasn't ready yet, and I was learning that it was okay to not be ready, that healing doesn't follow anyone else's timeline. Claire never called anymore, and I was grateful for that. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd gotten a job, something in retail management that was well beneath what she considered herself worthy of, but which paid the bills now that they were living within their actual means. I'd heard she'd had to sell her expensive car and drive something modest instead. I'd heard their rented townhouse was in a perfectly nice neighborhood, but that Claire hated it, hated the smaller spaces, hated running into her old country club friends at the grocery store when she was wearing regular clothes instead of designer outfits. I didn't take pleasure in her suffering exactly, but I didn't feel guilty about it either. She'd made choices that led her here, just like I'd made choices that led me to my peaceful little house with its yellow curtains and garden full of bulbs waiting for spring. We were both living with the consequences of who we'd chosen to be. The girl's birthday came in April. Emily turning 10 and Sarah turning 8, born just 2 years apart like their parents had planned. I thought about them all day, wondering if they were having parties, if they were happy in their new school, if they still thought about their grandma who'd disappeared from their lives. I bought 2 cards and wrote messages in them, sealed them up, addressed them carefully, and then put them in a drawer instead of mailing them. Someday I'd give those cards to my granddaughters, along with all the others I'd been writing and saving. Someday when they were old enough to understand, I'd sit down with them and explain everything. But not yet. Not while they were still young enough to be used as weapons in a war they hadn't started. Instead, I spent their birthday working in my garden, planting tomatoes and peppers and herbs in the little raised bed I'd built with help from Tom, my neighbor who was handy with tools and kind enough to spend an afternoon helping an old woman create something beautiful. My knees hurt by the time I finished, and my back ached, and my hands were covered in dirt, but I stood there looking at those neat rows of potential, seeds and seedlings that would grow into food and flowers if I tended them carefully. And I felt proud of myself. That night I made myself a nice dinner, nothing fancy but prepared with care. Roasted chicken with rosemary, steamed green beans, a baked potato with real butter. I set my small table with the good china I'd been saving for special occasions, and decided that a quiet Tuesday evening in my own home was special enough. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, and I didn't feel lonely. I felt peaceful. After dinner I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, wrapped in a blanket because April evenings were still chilly. And I thought about grace. Not the kind of grace that comes from being forgiving and understanding and endlessly patient with people who hurt you. The other kind. The kind that comes from accepting yourself exactly as you are, flaws and boundaries and needs and all. The kind that comes from saying, I matter, and meaning it, even when that disappoints people who preferred you invisible. Summer arrived with a gentleness I hadn't expected, bringing long golden evenings and the sweet smell of honeysuckle climbing the fence in my backyard. My garden had exploded into life, tomatoes heavy on their vines, basil growing so thick I had to give bunches away to neighbors, zinnias in every color blazing along the path to my front door. I spent my mornings out there with my coffee, just sitting in the peace of it, watching bees move from flower to flower, and feeling the sun warm on my face. I was different now. Not bitter exactly, but changed in some fundamental way that I couldn't quite articulate. The woman who'd signed those mortgage papers, who'd paid rent to live as a guest in a house her credit had bought, who'd shrunk herself smaller and smaller trying to avoid conflict, she felt like someone I'd known a long time ago. In her place was someone quieter maybe, more careful with her heart, but also stronger. Someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't negotiate it away for the illusion of being needed. The senior center had become my second home in a way I never expected. Beyond the Wednesday quilting circle, I'd started volunteering in their lunch program, helping serve meals to people even older and more fragile than myself. It felt good to be useful in a way that was appreciated, where people smiled and said thank you and nobody made me feel like my contribution was an obligation they resented. I'd made real friends there, Martha and Rosa from the quilting circle, but also Bill who was 75 and told terrible jokes, and Janet who was 68 and teaching me how to play bridge. These people knew my story by now, at least the parts that mattered, and they'd shared their own stories in return. Martha's daughter hadn't spoken to her in 12 years over some inheritance dispute. Rosa's son was in prison for embezzlement, and she visited him monthly even though it broke her heart every time. Bill's wife had died 2 years ago and he still set a place for her at dinner sometimes, just out of habit. Janet had never married, never had children, and she said it was the best decision she'd ever made even though people had pitted her for it her whole life. We were all carrying something heavy, I realized. All of us had made choices that hurt. All of us had been hurt by people we loved. All of us were trying to figure out how to live with grace in the time we had left. And somehow, sitting around a table playing cards or sewing quilt squares or sharing a simple lunch, we made each other's burdens a little lighter just by bearing witness to each other's pain. In July, I finally did it. I booked my New England fall foliage tour for October. The deposit alone made my hands shake as I wrote the check, but I did it anyway, and when the confirmation packet arrived in the mail with an itinerary and a list of what to pack, I sat in my living room holding it and laughing like a young girl. I was going on an adventure. Me, Maggie Thompson, 79 years old with bad knees and a modest pension, was going to ride a bus through Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, staying in bed and breakfasts and eating maple syrup, and taking photographs of covered bridges. I told everyone at the senior center about it, and they were genuinely excited for me. Martha helped me make a list of what clothes to bring. Bill gave me the name of a restaurant in Burlington that he and his late wife had loved. Rosa loaned me her good camera and taught me how to use it. Janet insisted on taking me shopping for comfortable walking shoes, saying I'd need them for all the quaint little towns I'd be exploring. Their enthusiasm made me feel seen and celebrated in a way I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten what it was like. One evening in late August, my doorbell rang just as the sun was setting. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my heart did a little skip when I looked through the window and saw Daniel standing there alone. He looked different than the last time I'd seen him. Thinner, older somehow, but also more present in a way that's hard to explain. Like he was actually inhabiting his own body instead of just going through motions. I opened the door slowly, and we stood there looking at each other for a long moment. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "I know you haven't been returning my calls. I needed to see you. Can I come in?" I almost said no. Part of me wanted to keep the boundary I'd built, wanted to protect the peace I'd worked so hard to create. But another part of me, the part that had rocked this man to sleep when he was a baby, that had held his hand at his father's funeral, that had loved him with every breath in my body for 50 years, that part won out. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in my living room, him on the sofa and me in my armchair, and for a while neither of us spoke. He looked around at my yellow curtains, at the photographs on my shelves, at the watercolor painting I'd done in class hanging on the wall. A clumsy attempt at my garden that Amy had insisted was beautiful. "Your home looks nice, Mom," he said finally. "It looks like you." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was shaking. "I've been in therapy for 6 months now, twice a week, working through a lot of stuff about myself, about my marriage, about how I became someone I don't recognize." He looked down at his hands, twisting them together in his lap. "My therapist asked me to write you a letter. I've written about 20 drafts, and I still don't think I can say everything I need to say, but I wanted to try. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, and his hands trembled as he unfolded it. But then he stopped, looked at me, and put it away again. Actually, no. I'm not going to read from a script. I'm just going to tell you the truth, however it comes out. I nodded, my throat tight, and waited. I failed you, he said simply. I know I said that before, but I don't think I really understood what it meant until recently. I didn't just fail you that one night when Claire screamed at you. I failed you for years. Every time I let her make little comments about your things, about your age, about you being in the way, I failed you. Every time I chose the easy path of keeping her happy over standing up for you, I failed you. Every time I pretended not to notice how small you were making yourself just to exist in our space, I failed you. Tears were running down his face now, but he kept talking. You sacrificed everything for me. Everything. You worked yourself to the bone so I could have a good life. You signed papers that put you at financial risk so I could have houses I couldn't actually afford. You paid rent and cooked and cleaned and babysat, and made yourself useful in 1,000 ways, because somewhere along the line I made you feel like your value to me was conditional on what you could provide. And I let you believe that because it was convenient for me. He wiped his face with his sleeve, just like he'd done on my porch months ago, and the gesture was so familiar it hurt. I don't expect you to forgive me, Mom. I don't expect us to go back to how things were, because how things were was broken even before that night. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see what I did, what I allowed, what I became. And I'm so sorry. I sat there listening to my son pour out his heart, and I felt a complicated tangle of emotions I couldn't begin to name. Pain and love and sadness and something that might have been the very beginning of healing, all mixed together in a knot in my chest. When he finally stopped talking and just sat there crying, I spoke the truth I'd been living with for months. I know you're sorry, Daniel. I believe you mean it. But sorry doesn't erase what happened. Sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent feeling worthless in your home. Sorry doesn't undo the moment you stood silent while your wife destroyed me. My voice was gentle but firm, and I saw him flinch at the words. I forgive you because holding on to anger would poison me, not because you've earned it. But forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to normal. Some things, once broken, stay broken. He nodded, his face crumpling, and I felt my own eyes fill with tears. I understand, he whispered. I wanted you to know I'm trying to be better. I'm working on it. Claire and I are in couples therapy too, and she's starting to understand some things about herself. We're not the same people we were. We're trying to actually live within our means, to teach the girls about gratitude and humility, to be honest about our mistakes. That's good, I said, and I meant it. I'm glad you're doing that work. I hope it helps you build a better life. Can I? His voice broke. Can I still call you sometimes? I know you don't answer, but just leaving messages, knowing you hear them eventually, it helps me feel like I haven't completely lost you. I thought about that for a long moment, weighing what I could give without sacrificing my own peace. You can call, I finally said. Once a month. And maybe someday I'll be ready to call back. But Daniel, I need you to understand something. I'm not your mother the way I used to be. I'm not available to fix things or sacrifice myself or put your needs before my own anymore. I'm just a person who loves you from a distance and hopes you find your way to being someone better. We talked for another hour after that, carefully and honestly, building the very beginnings of something new. Not the relationship we'd had before, but maybe something more real and less fragile. When he left, we didn't hug, but he paused in the doorway and said, I saw your garden, Mom. It's beautiful. You're blooming. And I realized he was right. October came with a riot of color, and I boarded that bus to New England with my borrowed camera and my comfortable shoes and a heart full of anticipation. For 7 days I wandered through small towns with their white-steepled churches and general stores. I ate at local diners and stayed in cozy rooms with handmade quilts. I took hundreds of photographs of red and gold leaves against impossibly blue skies. I met other travelers, some my age, some younger, and we shared meals and stories and laughter without any history or obligation weighing us down. On the last evening of the tour, sitting on the porch of a bed and breakfast in rural Maine, watching the sun set over mountains ablaze with autumn color, I felt something settle in my chest. Peace. Real, genuine peace that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or forgiveness or love. I'd spent so much of my life being someone's something. Someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden, someone's obligation. But here in this moment I was just Maggie. Just myself. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. I'm 80 years old now as I tell you this story, sitting in my living room with my yellow curtains and my clumsy watercolor paintings, and my photographs from New England hanging on the wall. Daniel calls once a month like I said he could, and last week I actually answered. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, his therapy, my quilting projects, the girls' progress in school. And it was careful and a little awkward but also okay. Progress, not perfection. I've learned something in these years since I walked out of that mansion and chose myself. It's never too late to bloom. It's never too late to say enough is enough, to draw boundaries, to choose your own worth over other people's comfort. The people who truly love you will learn to respect those boundaries. The people who don't, well, they were never really seeing you anyway. Some lessons hurt when they come with a moving van. But some lessons set you free. And freedom, I've discovered, is worth every single tear.